I forgot to do that last time. So, all right. So I'm planning on going through the policy debate workbook that I posted on the Facebook site. What I did last time is, I don't have time to go through it in as thorough detail as I did whenever I did the boot camp with my students. But I wanted to just kind of give an overview so that the parts of the notebook that aren't filled out, so that would make sense how you guys could do the same thing with your students. So I'm going to share my screen of the workbook, and we'll kind of go through that. Please, at any time, interrupt me if you have questions. I'm happy to answer questions along the way, and I'm sure that I won't realize exactly what. I might just talk too fast and not cover it thoroughly enough. So please interrupt and ask questions anytime if there are things that don't make sense. Okay, we'll go through this debate workbook. So first off, this page, the first few pages here, the what is policy debate. I didn't go over this a ton during our debate boot camp that I did with my students because I feel like the resource that CC provides, the tour guide, goes through a lot of this, just like the logistics of debate, how it works with the affirmative team and the negative team, and all the different speeches. And to me, that's a little bit easier to go through in class later once everybody has kind of a general understanding of what debate is. So I didn't go through that a ton. Sorry, I keep on getting new people joining, so I want to make sure I'm fitting everybody. But in general, I did cover just the fact that when we do policy debate, there's an affirmative team and a negative team. The affirmative team is going to be arguing for change, and they'll be arguing for making some sort of change in current policy. And then the negative team will be arguing against that change. The negative team will try to keep things the way that they are now, and the affirmative team wants to change them. The teams participate in several debate rounds, so every team will get a chance to be affirmative and negative. I believe that the guide assigns 3 weeks for debates, so depending on your class size, you may have to add an extra week, or you might be finished sooner than just 3 weeks, or I've had some people say that they did their debates during out of class time, just to make sure that they could fit everything in. But you do want to try your best to make sure that each team gets a chance to argue both for the affirmative and the negative. I think that's one of the beautiful things about debate, is that they're having to not just dig into one side, that they're really learning how to see both sides of the issue thoroughly. There's 8 speeches in one round. So there'll be 4 speeches that are called the constructive speeches. So those are all the ones that, when you start getting into this, will be labeled things like 1AC, first affirmative constructive, 2AC, second affirmative constructive. So those speeches are constructive speeches, the ones that are labeled with a C. And then the last 4 speeches are rebuttal speeches. In the first 4 speeches, the constructive ones, they're building their arguments for their case. And then the last 4 speeches, in the rebuttal speeches, they're not really making any new arguments. They're not supposed to make any new arguments, but they're supposed to build on and extend the arguments that have already been made in the constructive speeches. In between each of the constructive speeches, they have a chance to cross-examine, so they can ask questions to clarify. If they missed some of the points during their opponent's speech, they can ask them to repeat themselves. They can ask for credentials if they think that the sources that they used aren't great. They could ask for credentials for the sources, and they can also be used to expose weaknesses. And we'll get more into that throughout the semester. The tour guide book will give some ways to kind of practice cross-examinations, I believe, and that I think there's at least 1 week assigned in the guide to practice cross-examination. So similar to mock trial, there's the affirmative team has the burden of proof, and so they get the advantage of speaking first and then also last. So in order for that to happen, for the affirmative team to have the final say, the negative team ends up having 2 speeches back to back, and that's called the negative block. So again, that will be something that the tour guide gets into a little bit more. This right here is the debate order of speeches. So it goes through, I just had kind of a list of the order of the speeches in a debate round, and I didn't really cover this at all during my boot camp. I just pointed it out and had them where they can go back and look at it if they are interested. But that just lays out what 1 round of policy debate looks like. Okay, does anybody have any questions so far? Just interrupt me and ask questions if you have any.
Yes. Okay, on the policy debate, you keep saying the book. What is that? Just the guide, or is there a book? Or
yeah, so the resource that CC has recommended, or I guess required, for the policy debate is the tour guide to debate It's like a green book, and it has a
Okay.
DVD as part of it too. That book.
I thought that was just a DVD. Okay, I'm with you now. Sorry.
Yeah, it comes with a book as well. And I think there are assignments in the guide for the students to be reading through that book as part of it. I see somebody's raised their hand. You have a question? Does somebody else have a question?
Yeah, sorry. It took me a minute to unmute myself. I am wondering, which is the part where they, out of those 8 speeches, which is the parts where they like they're listening for what the other team is saying and they're kind of jotting down things that they could say against that, or I don't, or do they even do that? Do they jot down things and then bring up points that are against what the other team said, or are they just only asking like clarifying questions during that time? I'm confused about that.
Yeah, so every time that someone's giving a speech, and again, this isn't something that I covered in the debate boot camp, just in terms of having enough time, but during class, we'll cover some of this, but during each speech, there'll be, so for example, when the first affirmative constructive, so this when the first speaker is giving that speech, the other, that person's teammate won't necessarily have to take notes because they'll already know what's going to be put forth in the 1AC, but the 2 negative speakers will be taking notes on what the 1AC is saying, and so that way they'll be prepared during the cross-examination to ask questions if there are things that they missed. And there's a way to do that called flowing that the tour guide will go into a little bit, and we'll kind of practice during the year. But again, I didn't end up going into that during boot camp just for time's sake too much. I think I might have, somebody asked, and so I think I might have mentioned it barely, but there's a way that you can lay out your paper on like a legal pad to divide each speech up called flowing, and they can go through with like pointing arrows of like they made this argument, and then there's an arrow so that, to see if the next person's speech covers that argument that was made, so that way they can point out anything that was dropped. But the tour guide book will go into how to do that. And I think there may even be in the appendix of the guide, I think there may even be a sheet in there talking about flowing. I can't remember for sure, but
Okay, so the only time when they're really going to kind of refute things that have been said by the other team is during those cross examinations. They're not going to do that during any of those negative speeches or constructives or rebuttals or anything like that, or will they?
Yes, they will. So really the first affirmative constructive, that 1AC, is the only speech that's pre-written before the debate. So out of all the speeches, that 1AC is the only one that's completely pre-written.
Okay.
And really the rest of the debate is all based on what's said in that 1AC.
Okay. All right.
So the negative team will have a lot of things prepared so that they're ready for giving general arguments. They will have brainstormed what possibilities the affirmative team might bring up. So they'll have like a list of negative arguments that could be brought up against affirmative arguments, including some evidence and all that kind of stuff. But they won't know for sure what exact arguments the affirmative team is going to bring up until the actual debate. So then everything else is kind of in response to that 1AC. So this first negative constructive will be taking whatever was said in that 1AC and starting to attack, whatever points were made there with their own evidence. So really the whole debate is a back and forth of refuting each other's arguments.
Okay, gotcha.
That makes sense. Okay, anybody else have any questions? Okay, I'm going to go on here then. So during our debate boot camp, we went through this Annie chart here. The issue that I used for the beginning of the boot camp, I wanted to pick an issue that they were able to pull a lot of information from their brains. So I didn't want to pick some kind of issue that somebody might not know anything about. Just for this first part. So I decided to do whether every household in the United States should adopt a pet from an animal shelter. So we worked through this Annie chart similar to what you would do in class for LTW. Just give me some affirmative points and give me some negative points. It's funny, last year I had a class that was very pro-animal, and we had tons of affirmative points and not a lot of negative points. And then I think this class that I worked through this with this year, I didn't do the full boot camp last year because I just kind of came up with all this stuff, but we worked through it in class. But this year, the students that I worked through with this boot camp, they were way more practical and just saying, there's no way you could do that. You couldn't have every household do that. So we had a lot more negative points. So anyway, that's kind of funny. But here, whenever I switch tabs like that, can everybody see the Annie chart that's filled in whenever I switch tabs?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. I'm never sure how the sharing screen things work. So, okay, so then this is in general some of the arguments that we came up with when we were going through that issue. And I try to use the interesting column when we're brainstorming for debate. to put things there that are questions that we have about what the policy is requiring, or any questions we have if we're not really sure exactly how that would work. So some of the things that got put in our interesting column were does the policy allow for exceptions? Does any animal count? What if the current pet that they have dies? What's the definition of household? What's the definition of adopt? What's the definition of pet? What would be the punishment for non-compliance? So if a household didn't adopt a pet, what would happen? What if the shelter runs out of pets? Who tracks compliance? Which person in the household is responsible for the pet? So we had a lot of questions like that that we would just put in the interesting column. And you'll see later how that interesting column helps when we start developing mandates later. I think that's a helpful place to put that. But anyway, you can see how there's some affirmative and negative arguments about whether or not it'd be good for everybody to have to adopt a pet from an animal shelter. And then here on the bottom of the Annie charts, after I kind of let them brainstorm the same as we did in class, I asked them some of these questions down here just to make sure we generate all the ideas that I wanted to have on the Annie chart. So I asked them, what's the situation like right now? What bad things are happening right now? Are there benefits to keeping things the way they are? How hard will it be to make that change? What good things will happen if the change is made? What bad things will happen if the change is made? Who will be in charge of enforcing the change? And then is there a better solution to the problem? Just to get their brains kind of churning. Does anybody have questions about any of that? The Annie stuff should be fairly familiar. Let's see, it looked like I might have something in the chat window here. Trying to figure out where that is, sorry.
I was just wondering, do you have, gosh, I'm like hearing my voice echo somebody's speakers. The questions that you have down there are really great questions. Are those questions that like you feel kind of just apply to, pretty much any debate argument? Like you could, like, are those just kind of standard questions that you often use when you're doing this with your students? Or did you think about those ahead of time specific to this issue?
Yeah, so I didn't have this list of questions whenever I went through stuff last year with my class, but when I was putting together this workbook, I thought that it would be very helpful for them. I'm really encouraging them to keep this workbook for next year to kind of have some questions in their head. And you'll see later as we go through some other aspects of debate why it's important to have thought through some of those questions just in the general brainstorming. They're all questions that kind of help set up some of the parts of the policy debate later on. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm not seeing, I don't know why, but I'm not able to pull the chat window up. So if you guys have questions, just ask questions because I'm not sure I can see where the chat window is saying.
Okay, I just unmuted myself, and I'm sorry, I came in a little bit late, so please forgive me if you've already gone over this, but I was wondering, I have 3 questions for you. How many, is this boot camp and the debate marathon, can this be found in the files section of the challenge 1? Did you upload this in there on the Facebook page?
Yes, it's policy debate workbook, I think is what I called it. I think
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
And how many weeks do you run this for?
So I did this actually, oh, there's the group chat. I did this on a 1-day boot camp kind of thing. We did it from 9 o'clock in the morning till 3 in the afternoon with like a 30-minute break. But then I'm planning on using this workbook. We didn't thoroughly get through we kind of just skimmed through the end part of the workbook just for time's sake. So we'll use it in class, partly just to have already some of the debate terminology like harms and things like that we'll get to in a minute, so that they have a quick thing that they can refer back to with examples from this simple issue, the pet issue, that I can refer back to during class. So that's how I handled it. I think you don't really have class time. It would be hard to cover all of it in class time.
Okay, so what week did you do your boot camp on? When do you think that would be a good idea?
I did mine a couple weeks ago, so over the summer. But it could work to do it once CC starts as well. And you could go through like little chunks of it, I guess, during class time, just as you're introducing stuff. I wanted to go ahead and have them have a general understanding of some of the debate terminology, but that's not at all required. That's not something that CC recommends or anything like that. So you could just try to cover it in small chunks during class.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. And then somebody asked, which week did I use the Annie chart before? So for this pet issue, we did the Annie chart during this boot camp. And then, but during the actual issue that we're going to use for our first semester debate, so we're not going to use this pet issue for my first semester debate. I just wanted to introduce the debate terminology with kind of a silly issue, which you'll see in that tour guide book. they use an issue about banning Christmas carols, which I just think it's helpful because the technical terms are a little bit confusing. So I didn't want to add to that by having a complicated issue that I was introducing along with the debate terminology. So the pet issue is just for this debate boot camp. And then for first semester debate, we'll be doing the issue about body cameras, which we brought up at the end of this workbook. So you'll see in a minute. So then we would use that Annie chart. We kind of brainstormed an Annie chart during our debate boot camp for the body camera issue as well. But that's something that I told them we'll be adding to throughout the semester as they continue to do their research. We only covered 2 articles during the boot camp that I printed out and we kind of went through during there, but they'll read a lot more articles about the body camera issue. And so that Annie chart will kind of be one that we keep adding to as we go. Does that answer that question? Anybody else have questions?
I was wondering in class about how much time do you devote to, do you have a pretty specific amount of time that you split to cover, this portion of the debate strand and the other portion of the debate strand?
Yeah, what I've heard a lot of people say is really the debate strand for challenge 1 is really like 2 strands.
Right.
And so what they recommend, I think, is to split all of the strands up to about 40 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes, depending on how long your community meets. I think that's what I heard. So you'll spend 40 minutes or so on policy debate and then 40 minutes or so on the American documents.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Often the logic during first semester, the not math logic, the reasoning logic is pretty light. So I often would pull just a little bit of time from that and then a little bit of time from math sometimes too, just to make that work depending on what your schedule is of how many hours you have available split up. Okay, anybody else have questions?
Ashley, I had a question.
Yes.
The Annie chart, and you mentioned the articles that they would be reading. Are
Yes.
they filling the Annie chart with pure opinion, or when did they read through actual documents?
Right. Yeah. So for the boot camp, I wanted to use this simple issue that it's all just kind of from their head, just for this beginning part. But you'll see at the end of the workbook, there's an Annie chart or towards the end for the body camera issue. And that's going to be pretty much all from the articles that they read, partly just because they're not going to have a lot of information in their head about police body cameras, but they can put just opinions on the Annie chart if there are things that they know. But when they actually construct their 1AC, their first affirmative constructive speech, which is kind of the case that they're building for their debate, they're going to want to pick things that have evidence to back up those points. So really the Annie chart is for brainstorming, and then you might have to do more research if you have an affirmative point that just kind of came from your head, you could always do some more research to find evidence to back that up. But we'll get into that a little bit more at the end of this as we go through the body camera issue. So that might make more sense.
Thank you.
Towards the end. Okay, I'm going to move on, but y'all ask questions if you have some. So during our debate boot camp, we went through, after we did the Annie chart, I started talking about some debate terminology that's kind of more specific to debate. So first is status quo. I think a lot of the students don't necessarily know what that word means or that phrase means. So hang on, I'm sorry, I have a couple of people that are entering the meeting. I want to make sure I admit them. So status quo is the existing state or condition of things. So, or the current system or policy that the affirmative team wants to change. So what would be the status quo for this case?
That not everyone has to adopt a shelter pet.
Right, right. So the status quo here, there's not any laws regarding adopting pets. Nobody has to adopt a pet from a shelter. And so then I also brought up just another example just to practice status quo. And I asked them, what would the status quo be about the legal driving age in Alabama? Because they're all right at that age where everybody knows when they're going to be allowed to drive. So then I got lots of answers, that you have to get your permit first and you have to have it for 6 months, and you get your permit when you're 15, and you can get your driver's license when you're 16. So all those things would be the status quo. So if I wanted to change the status quo for legal driving age, then I might say, well, I'm going to raise the driving age to 17 instead of 16. So it's important that they understand status quo, because the affirmative team is going to be arguing against the status quo in some way, and the negative team is going to be defending the status quo. So both sides really need to understand what the current state of things are so that they know what they're arguing. And that gets a little bit more complicated in the issue like the body cam issue, which we'll talk through when we get there. Okay, and then next was, we talked about the resolution. So in the case for the, I'm thinking I might have pulled up an older version of the workbook for resolution. I don't remember if the one that I attached on Facebook might already have something filled in here, but the resolution that we used for the policy debate boot camp for the pet issue was the United States government should take action to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America. So I'll say that again in case the version you guys have might already have this written in, but the United States government should take action to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America is the resolution that we use. So the resolution is going to be a general call for a general change. The resolution will be something that everyone knows before the debates begin. So affirmative team and negative team have the exact same, it's the same resolution. The affirmative team will be arguing for the resolution, and the negative team will be arguing against the resolution. Okay.
So you're saying the resolution is general, and then throughout the debate, each team is arguing the specifics of that?
Right. Yeah, so later on we'll get into, yes, I'll bring this back up again when we get to the mandate portion and bring up the differences between those two, because that was a confusion the first year of debate.
Sure.
I did it last year, that I think some people got confused about that, but I'll come back to that when we get to mandates.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so the affirmative goes with the resolution, is that correct? And then
Yes.
the negative against the resolution?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then we went into definitions. So these are all, starting with the resolution, these are all parts of the 1AC. And you'll see at the end of this first section, I have kind of a summary of what the first affirmative constructive speech, that kind of the template of what that looks like. But we're moving into the resolution and then definitions. These are all parts of that 1AC speech. So in definitions, this is an area that I feel like people are tempted to skip or just to not worry too much about. But the definitions are super important in a debate case. So the meanings of keywords are defined by the affirmative team to provide clarification for the round. Keywords in the resolution and any other parts of the affirmative team's plan or evidence that might be unclear should be defined. And definitions help show that the affirmative team's plan falls under the resolution agreed upon before the debate. And I'm going to show you guys in a second what I mean by that. So in the resolution, if we said that the United States government should take action to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America, I would say that the words that need to be defined in that resolution would be United States government should take action. So that's take action is kind of a phrase instead of just, you couldn't necessarily just define take and then define action. So often for something like take action, you would want to look up kind of online and find somewhere that has a definition for take action, which would mean a little bit different than the two words separate. And then significantly improve welfare, pets, and America. So it really is almost every word in the resolution that you would define, but you don't necessarily have to read every single one of those definitions when you read your 1AC. You'll notice that there's the amount of time given to read the 1AC is fairly short for the amount of information you could put in the 1AC. So what my son competes in a debate club, and what his debate club coach has told them is to define all the words and have them available in case you need to use them later on in the debate, or if the other side asks for a definition. But you might just read just the ones that you think are the most key. And that's going to depend on how much time maybe you would have to read those. But you need to go ahead and define all of them and have them available. One word that I brought up for our debate boot camp, I think you might look at some of those words and think, well, everyone agrees what those words mean, and it seems kind of silly to have to define them. Well, for the word significantly, let me see if I can pull up the, I wonder if I can, if it'll let me just type on this. Maybe not. Okay, so for the word significantly, just listen closely. There are 3 different definitions that I found for the word significantly. So the first one is important enough to be worthy of attention. So important enough to be worthy of attention. Second definition is fairly large in amount or quantity. And then the third definition is having or likely to have a major effect. So the first definition, important enough to be worthy of attention. If we were doing this pet issue, I could change something in the status quo, and as long as it was an important enough change that it made news somewhere, so that was worthy of some sort of attention, then it would meet the requirement for the resolution in regards to the word significantly, as long as whatever change I made was significant enough to be worthy of attention. But if I had the second definition that said fairly large in amount or quantity, and I had some sort of plan that only affected a small number of pets in the state of Alabama, then the negative team could possibly argue that my plan did not fit the resolution because I did not significantly improve the welfare of pets, because I did not improve them in a fairly large amount or quantity. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Does anybody have questions about that?
Ashley, could you
Yes.
just say that one more time? Would you be
Yes.
able to do that one more time, please?
Yeah, let me see if I can find a way that I can just, I'm gonna stop the sharing and just try to do a whiteboard real quick, because I know I do better if I can see it too. Let me see if I can just share like a whiteboard. There we go. And I'll type that out. There we go. Okay, so the first definition was important enough to be worthy of attention. Okay. Oh, let me edit that, but it's not going to be all in great order here, but I haven't learned Zoom whiteboard very well yet. So fairly large in amount or quantity. And then the third definition was having or likely to have a major effect. Okay, so if we were going to be arguing for that resolution, if you remember back to what the resolution said was the United States government should take action to significantly, spell that correctly, significantly improve the welfare of pets in America. Okay, so if my resolution was the United States government should take action to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America, and then I had these three different definitions: important enough to be worthy of attention, fairly large in amount or quantity, having or likely to have a major effect. So as the affirmative team, I would probably want to pick this definition, this first definition here, the important enough to be worthy of attention, because the only thing I have to do in order to meet the definition of significantly is to make sure that I do something that's important enough to be worthy of some kind of attention. But if I decided that I wanted to read this definition instead, if I picked the fairly large in amount or quantity, I would want to make sure that whatever plan I come up with to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America, improve the welfare of lots of pets. So it would be fine to choose this definition if my plan actually does affect a fairly large in amount or quantity the number of pets. Or if I pick this definition, having or likely to have a major effect, I would want to make sure that whatever plan that I put in place later on, the actual specific action that I'm taking to fulfill the resolution, that I can show that it's having a major effect on the welfare of pets in America. Does that make sense? Does that make a little bit more sense now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so then somebody said, would you have them provide both definitions or combine the definitions? So I would have them pick whichever definition they think is best for their case. But you do want to make sure you're getting it from a reputable source. So I wouldn't want to pick my definitions from ilovepets.com, right? Like that wouldn't be, you'd want to make sure you had like a credible dictionary source for your definition. Okay, quickly from one other example. Let's see if I can clear all of that. So let me type up that resolution again. I should have deleted that part. The United States Okay, if I wanted to look up the definitions for government, I found 3 different definitions for government as I was looking for those definitions. So first definition was the officials comprising the governing body of a political unit. Second was, it said specifically in this definition, this was from Merriam-Webster, it said in parentheses like that capitalized, it said the executive branch of the U.S. federal government. And then the third definition said the complex of political institutions, laws, and customs through which the function of governing is carried out. So for this one, I thought it was interesting that this capitalized one, in our resolution, we had the word capitalized. So if you use that definition later on, when we're going to be asking who's going to be passing our plan, we would kind of be forced into just saying the executive branch passing our plan, which kind of doesn't make sense for our case here, because the executive branch doesn't make laws. The legislative branch makes laws. So that definition wouldn't really make sense. You wouldn't want to necessarily use that definition. You'd use either the first definition or the third definition. Probably the third one, because it's including laws and kind of is more broad. Okay, does that make sense? I'm gonna stop sharing that and then come back to the debate workbook. So for our the debate marathon thing that we did, I brought up those two examples for them. And then I brought several different dictionaries, one kind of older dictionary and then several newer ones. And then I asked them to bring dictionaries. So we had kind of a variety of dictionaries. And I believe we looked up the word pet, and we also looked up the word household. And we'll see later how those definitions, depending on what you get there, it really affects what your arguments you can make, depending on how you're defining what a pet is and how you're defining what a household is. So we kind of just brainstormed, or we just kind of just went through those where I had somebody look up definitions for each of those, and then we kind of compared and talked through how those different definitions would benefit one side or the other. Okay, any questions about definitions? I had some questions down here to ask, which we kind of have already talked about. Are there words that have multiple meanings? Are some meanings more advantageous to one side? And then are there any phrases or technical terms in the case that should be defined? Okay, then we went into harms. So harm is a debate term that's used to describe the bad things that are happening in the status quo that need to be fixed. So this was an area that I think I had to keep on reminding my students last year. This can be confusing. They sometimes will get this mixed up with what's wrong with things when the plan is passed. So this is all talking about before we take any action at all, just in the status quo right now, what's wrong. And the reason why we would have harms, one of the first things that's mentioned in the 1AC are harms, is because we need to show that there's something wrong in order to argue that we need to change it. So that whole phrase of if it ain't broke, then it doesn't need to be fixed. So we need to make sure that something's broken in order to show that we need to fix it. So the harm should be significant. We need to, if the affirmative team can't show that the current system is flawed, then there's no reason to change anything. And then we need to be careful, and we'll get into this later, you have to be careful how you word your harms, because the affirmative team's plan needs to be able to solve the harms that they list. So you wouldn't want to list a harm saying world hunger, right? Because we can't necessarily solve world hunger with our law that we're going to change. We can't make it where no one's ever hungry again, right? So you want to pick your harms and word them in a way that you're going to be able to solve for them. So then we kind of brainstormed here with some possible harms. So what would be the reason why we'd want to pass this? We'd want to have a plan to fulfill this resolution to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America. So we looked back at our Annie that we went through. You can often find some harms here in the Annie. So some of this takes some creative rewording, but here the first affirmative reason why we should adopt pets is that fewer pets would die. Well, how could we reword? Well, I'll just say how we could reword it, and then I'm going to ask you guys to chime in some. But so we could reword fewer pets would die. We could say that lots of animals are dying every year, or many animals are being euthanized by shelters every year. And that would be rewording that into making it a harm, showing what's wrong with the current state of things that needs to be fixed. Animals are abandoned. That's kind of already worded like a harm. One of the reasons why we need to have people adopt pets is that animals are abandoned. Let's see, pets make people happy. You could say people are unhappy without pets. Now, again, that would be if you worded it that way, that might be a hard way to solve. You might have a hard time solving and saying that we're going to make everybody happy. Let's see, I think of an easy one here that are easy to. Pets keep people from loneliness. How could you reword that into a harm? So we could say that many people in the US are lonely. And then we could say that that would help if people had pets. That might help with people's loneliness, that people might not be as lonely. Shelters need help. So that would be another one that's worded well already as a harm, that pet shelters need help. Puppy mills, you could say that breeders, that there are some breeders that are puppy mills that are mistreating their pets, things like that. Okay, so that we kind of went through and brainstormed some harms, what's wrong with the current system, of why we need to change that. And there's some questions below there to ask. What effects are the current policies or lack of policies having on society? If nothing changes, will conditions worsen? Who is affected by these problems? How widespread is the problem? Is the problem widespread enough to warrant change? Will things improve on their own without any action? And then are any basic rights being violated under the current policy? So we kind of laughed about this of, saying, well, what about, dogs' rights? Are their rights being violated by being crowded into all these shelters? And anyway, with the silly issue, that's kind of easy to come up with some things like that we're just making up. And then we went through this next page, just practicing. So in a real debate, you would always have evidence backing up your harms. So in this issue, I didn't want to bring in articles about the pet issue to get actual evidence. So I just encourage some of my more creative students to come up to just make some evidence up, which you never can do in a real debate. But every harm, when we list it in our 1AC, would have a tagline that would say something like, animals are being euthanized, or many animals are euthanized every year. And then our evidence might be something like the exact number of, so 1 million animals, 1 million dogs are euthanized by shelters, every year. And we'd have the source where we got that from, where we got that evidence from. And then impact is a big part of your speech. When we give something like a harm and give some evidence, we always want to tell the judges, why does this matter? So a lot of times people will read in debate tournaments very technical evidence that maybe they need to have to back up their point. But judges are just listening. They're not able to see to read along. And so often judges, and I've had to judge a lot of debates with my son's debate club, it's easy as a judge to get lost pretty quickly of what in the world does that evidence even mean? And so it's very important for debaters to impact their evidence, telling the judge, so what? Why should they care? How does that evidence relate to what their tagline said? What's the significance of that problem? So for the impact for that, maybe you'd sum it up by saying, so as you can see, there are millions of animals every year that die when they didn't have to die because they're crowded into shelters, or however you want to do that. But you want to kind of make that really matter. And I kind of compared that to amplification and LTW, that you're wanting to show, why does this matter? To whom does it matter, and why does it matter? Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to move on. We just practiced a couple of those examples during the debate boot camp. Okay, then we get into the plan. So this was confusing, I believe, for a lot of people last year as well, and I'm not sure that I understood it completely. The plan actually is made up of several different parts. So the plan will lay out the specific changes that the affirmative team wants to make to solve the problems with the status quo. So the plan is the mandates, the agency, funding, and enforcement. All of those things make up the plan that the affirmative team will propose in order to fulfill the resolution. So the differences here between the plan and the resolution, the plan is a general call for change. So our plan, our resolution, if you remember, was that the United States government should take action to significantly improve the welfare of pets in America. So there are a lot of plans that could maybe fulfill that resolution. We can improve the welfare of pets in America maybe by punishing people who do dog fighting, or by I don't know, my brain's not working great, but there are other ways that we could fulfill that resolution. And then, so in our case, what we did for our mandates was what we brainstormed there earlier in the Annie chart. So the exact change that I want to make in order to fulfill that resolution would be to require every household in the United States to adopt a pet from a shelter. So again, it's kind of silly. That's obviously not a plan that you could really propose to Congress to force every household in America to adopt a pet. But I'm kind of picked that silly issue on purpose so that the kids would be engaged and think that that's funny. I see a chat coming up, but I can't pull it up for some reason again. Let's see if I can get that chat window pulled up. Okay, whoever asked a question in chat, if you could just say it, because I don't know, my chat window is not cooperating for some reason here.
That was me. It was back on the research, how you said you didn't provide research, you kind of just made stuff up. Do you think it'd be a good idea to have some things printed out, maybe good and bad choices, so that you can show them how to reference it and how to choose a good reference or good piece of evidence versus a poor choice like Wikipedia and ilovedogs.com?
Right. Yeah, so you could do that. I did have some things that I was planning on using, but what I decided to do was that I wanted to cover all of this fairly quickly during the debate marathon and then spend my time on the serious issue later. So I did print out articles for them, and then we did more practicing for the body camera issue later on, showing them how to quote from sources and all that. So yes, we did use actual articles for the issue later.
Do you feel like you would have ran out of time if you had added the research part into the marathon?
Definitely. Yeah,
Okay.
for the pet issue, because we didn't even have time to cover everything I wanted to for the body cam issue. Now, if you had this as like a 2-day thing or added some time, you could do that. It is a little harder to find like serious evidence for this pet issue because this mandate is so silly. Like, I don't think anybody's calling for making every home in the United States adopt a pet. So you'd have a little bit of a hard time finding good evidence for that. I really just wanted to use something that we could just get totally from our brain, just to practice the terminology of debate. Okay, so our mandate in this case for the pet issue would be that we would require every household in the United States to adopt a pet, or however we worded that in the Annie up there. So that's the specific change that fulfills the resolution. What is very helpful for first-time debaters for first semester in Challenge, we're not going to be, if you were part of a debate club, the resolution, for instance, in my son's debate club last year was the United States government should significantly, can't remember what it is, significantly change or something like that. It's banking, monetary, or finance policy, something like that. And so all the mandates, the plans that affirmative teams came up with were very, very different. So I saw an affirmative team that had a plan to abolish the Federal Reserve, an affirmative team that had a plan to have better regulations on overseas banking. I saw plans to abolish the penny, no longer mint the penny, plans to stop producing the nickel, all kinds of different plans. There was a plan about some sort of welfare thing that they argued fit into that resolution. But for our cases, for our case for CC, we're supposed to just be giving kind of an overview of debate for this year, and we're not getting into that much detail like you would if you were part of a debate club. So I think it's very helpful for first semester debate to have agreed upon some limiting to the mandates. What I did last year, though, I think what you can do is basically have the resolution already laying out what's going to happen. So last year we had, I think our resolution was something like the United States government should abolish the Electoral College and replace it with the popular vote. So we had that as our resolution. And then our mandates, though, were basically just abolish the Electoral College and replace it with a popular vote. And everyone had the same thing there, which made it a lot simpler because everybody knew exactly what the plan was, what the specific plan was going to be. But I think it got very confusing to the students, the difference between the resolution and the mandates, because that first semester, they were basically the same thing. Then second semester, when we tried to pick something a little bit more involved, we ended up doing something about gun control. So our resolution said something like the United States should increase its gun control laws or something like that. And I had several students, it took most of the semester to get it in their head because they would have in their mandates, they put mandate 1, increase gun control in the United States. And that's not what a mandate should look like. A mandate should be a specific change, like you were going to Congress and saying, I want to pass this specific law. And you couldn't go to Congress and say, I want to pass a law that says increase gun control. Well, what do you mean? In what ways do you increase gun control? So I think it's important for them to understand that the resolution is going to call for some general change, and then the mandate is going to call for a specific change. So if the resolution said increase gun control, you might have a mandate that says ban assault rifles in the United States, or require background checks for all gun purchases in the United States, or something like that. That would be a specific change. So what I recommend, what I'm going to do this semester, and hopefully it will work well, what you'll see later with the body cam issue, is I'm going to have a resolution that calls for changing policing in the United States. And then the mandates, I'm going to require everyone to have their mandates relating to body cameras. And I'm going to require everyone to have at least one mandate that would require police officers to wear body cameras. So that way I'm still narrowing the issue so that everyone knows that it has to be something about body cameras, but they're still going to see that the resolution is different than the mandates. That's my goal anyway. We'll see if it works. But that's my plan for first semester. CC has put out some really helpful packets on the Electoral College and on the death penalty. So we used that packet last year for the Electoral College, and that was super helpful. I do think the Electoral College, at least in our case, was not the best thing to do for a first semester debate because most of my students didn't understand the Electoral College. So we kind of had to, didn't really understand anything about the Electoral College, a lot of them. So it took a lot of time just to even understand what the basic issues were. And I think something like the death penalty is a little bit simpler for first semester. And I'm hoping that this body cam issue as well, although there's tons that you really could spend the whole semester researching the body camera issue, at least at the surface, it's a little bit easier to understand. Either they're wearing the cameras or they're not, instead of something like the Electoral College that's a little bit more complicated. Okay, so for this case, for the pet case, the mandate, and you can have more than one mandate, but for the pet case, we just did the mandate that it would require every household in the United States to adopt a pet from a shelter. And then we looked back up at our Annie chart and saw all these questions that we have here about, does a policy allow for exceptions? Does any animal count? All those things. What you could do in your mandates, we could have the one mandate that says that every household has to adopt a pet. And then we could have another mandate that says that if you can't adopt a pet, then you can choose to pay a fine instead or opt out by paying some amount instead. So that would help a lot of our negative points here, saying that people are allergic or whatever else. We could have a mandate that would maybe do away with some of those negative points by saying, well, everybody doesn't necessarily have to, they could just pay a fine instead. So we kind of brainstormed, what other mandates could we add here that would maybe help make our plan make more sense or not have as many negative points. Yes.
I have a question about those mandates. Do you suggest for us, especially as we're getting started with this first one, it's, you're coming up with these great ideas for mandates. Is that, and like, you're obviously very forward thinking, like, well, the other team might say this, so we might need to address this. Like when our students did mock trial, we sort of left that up to them, and it really needed to be all their ideas and all their work. Are you suggesting, or would you suggest for this first round that we really take a more active role as tutors in helping them think through these, come up with ideas for mandates? Or would you recommend that we sort of kind of throw the questions out there and let them come up with it like we did with mock trial and just sort of let it be their own thing?
Yeah, so I would limit it for sure. So giving them some sort of, like in my case, we're going to do the resolutions policing, something about, I forget the way I worded it, but improving policing in the United States. And I'm going to I told them that all their mandates have to be about body cameras. Because I don't want them to be able to talk about body cameras or about, I don't know, defunding the police or about all the other ways that you could reform policing in the United States, because it makes it way too overwhelming, especially for this first debate, for the negative team to have to completely prepare for that many different areas of reform. So I would definitely limit it to some small area. If you were going to be doing like the Electoral College, I believe that in the guide, I believe it says something about election reform. So if you were going to do Electoral College, I would say, well, then your mandates need to focus on just the Electoral College, not on broad election reform, because then you're going to get people coming in, or they could come in wanting to do away with absentee voting or require people to register beforehand, or who knows what else you could come up with election reform. And it would just get very complicated for a first debate. So I would limit it. And then what we do is we try to just brainstorm in class what possible mandates you could come up with. And there are problems that come up with, like we'll talk about later with the policing thing. If we ended up adding a mandate saying that police officers have to wear their body cams all the time, have to have it on all the time. Well, we might, if we do that, then we get rid of one of the negatives of saying that police officers have the discretion then to turn off and on, and then they're not going to capture the bad things. We get rid of that negative if we say they have to leave it on all the time. But then we add another negative of saying, well, now we've got hours and hours and hours of video that has to be stored. That's going to cost a lot of money. And so I really want to go there with the students of brainstorming. If we add this mandate, well, good, we've just gotten rid of one negative, but we've added another negative. And I want them to see, especially this first semester, really working through that process with them But I don't tell them like you have to pick except for that one. I do tell them you have to pick one mandate that says that they need to wear body cameras all the time, just because I want to simplify for the negative team. But then the other they can add up to 2 other mandates. In my case, I'm going to let them add up to 2 other mandates, and they can pick whatever ones they want. But we're going to brainstorm together to help with that. And they can pick ones that we haven't brainstormed if they come up with something that we haven't. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. So it sounds like you're kind of taking a bit of a middle ground on sort of helping but not over helping.
Right. Yeah. And I think they'll need that with this. I think, it's so foreign to them that they'll need a little bit of
Sure.
I think with this. And again, what you could do is you could basically have it where everybody has the same mandate. I think one of the options for the election reform, I think that was recommended, was just to say the mandate is to abolish the electoral college and replace with the popular vote. And that would be perfectly fine as well, to not even have just cutting out the brainstorming for mandates at all for this first semester. I do think letting them see the difference between the resolution and mandates is good though.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. And then I'm going to real quickly just go through these last ones. Parts of the plan. The agency is just who will pass the plan. Pretty much in most cases in policy debate, the agency is going to be Congress and the president, because you need Congress to pass the law and then the president to sign it into action. Funding. So if the plan requires funding, then the 1AC has to list where the funding comes from. So sometimes you'll have cases that don't require any funding. So you could just say there that it's purely legislative and that it doesn't require funding. For this pet case, going back to this pet case, it would cost money in order to enforce, like to make sure that everybody is actually complying with that. So they could be creative and say that we're going to get the funding from all the fines for people who aren't complying or people that decide to opt out, that they would use that funding to pay for the enforcement. Or you could say you'd raise taxes. What I always laugh about though is if you raise taxes too much, then your judges that are judging the debate round might not like it if you're talking about raising their taxes. So a lot of times they'll try to find some creative way that like it funds itself, or they're taking money from something that they think is getting too much money from. And I don't get too nitpicky about the funding stuff because it's a policy debate. They're not actually going and getting a real law passed. So as long as it's something that makes somewhat of sense, they're not just saying I'm going to use my allowance money to fund it or something, then I think it's fine for our situation here in CC. And then enforcement, who will ensure the plan is actually carried out. So it can be police departments, FBI, the IRS, whatever. In our case, we laughed about and said that we would have PETA, the people for the ethical treatment of animals, were going to be the enforcers of our case. I think we also mentioned the Department of Agriculture, I think is typically over animal kind of related things. So that's what we were saying for our pet issue. Okay. And then the next part of the 1AC is the advantages. So the advantages are the good things that will happen if the plan is passed. You can think about advantages as the opposite of harms. So a good plan would not only solve the harms, solve the bad things going on, but also bring about good things. So again, we could look back at our pet, Annie, that we did, that a lot of times you can take your harm and reword it and turn it into an advantage. So we said we changed fewer pets would die. We changed that for our harm to say something like lots of animals are being euthanized or whatever else. Well, the advantage would be that fewer pets would die if we passed our plan, because we'd have more people adopting from shelters so they wouldn't be euthanized. Animals are abandoned was a harm. Well, we could reword that and say fewer animals. Well, I guess they'd still be abandoned in our case, but that fewer animals would be left in shelters, maybe you'd say, for an advantage. Pets make people happy. So you could say more people would be happier if we had everybody adopt a pet from a shelter. Kids would learn responsibility. People wouldn't be as lonely because people would have companionship with their pets. Pets would encourage people to get more exercise. Anyway, you get the idea. So advantages for the plan. So I encouraged them for this issue, just for the amount of time we had, to brainstorm some advantages. But then later when we talk about the body camera issue, that's another area where both harms and advantages, you kind of have a running list that you're continually adding to, both as the affirmative team and the negative team, because you want to brainstorm all the possible ways that they might say that their plan is bringing about some advantages so that you can be prepared to argue against that if you're on the negative team. And then I had some questions to ask to just help them with the brainstorming. What good things will happen if the plan is passed? How does the plan benefit society? How does the plan benefit individuals? are the advantages significant compared to the harms? So we don't want to have harms that are really, really bad and then have advantages that are just like no big deal, that, you know, barely improve anything. Will everyone benefit from the plan? Are the advantages guaranteed if the plan passes? Could the advantages come about in a different way other than the plan? And will the advantages happen even if the plan isn't passed? So I tell them for their real case later to list even advantages that they might not think that they would want to use. So even if it isn't significant compared to the harms, list it anyway. But whenever you go to actually choose which advantage you want to use, keep all those questions in mind so that you're picking some really good advantages that you would put in your actual final plan. But we want to brainstorm first, even if they're not the ones you would use finally. And then we did the same thing as we did with the advantages, where we practiced an advantage tagline. So that would just be the short little thing like saying that fewer animals would be euthanized. That would be the tagline. And then we'd have some evidence, and then the source, and then impacted. You know, and the impact would again be like an amplification, telling the judge who does that matter, to whom does that matter, and why. Okay. I'm going to move on because there's still a lot to cover. So if anybody has questions, though, interrupt me. I included in here just a simple 1AC template just so they could see what a 1AC would look like. So when they give, again, like the reason why we spend so much time here at the beginning just going over the 1AC is the 1AC is the basis for the entire debate round. So the 1AC is really what we spend a lot of our time brainstorming. And even on the negative side, all these things are things that you would be brainstorming anyway about harms and advantages and all that, so that you can be prepared for the actual debate. So we'd start off with an introduction. I encourage using an exordium to capture the judge's attention. We want to make sure that and you'll see here in a few pages, we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but we want to use all the tools of persuasion that we have. We don't want this to just be boring, where you just list a bunch of things. We want to have the exordium that really captures their attention. You introduce the team members, and then you state the resolution and your support for it. And then you would go through your definitions, defining the important terms, and be sure to list the source for where you got your definitions. And then you would have 2 to 3 harms, including the supporting evidence and impacting for each harm as you go. And then the plan, so the mandate, the agency, funding, and enforcement. And then 2 to 3 advantages are listed, same thing with supporting evidence and impacting. And then the conclusions. You would summarize your important points, give a clincher, like if your exordium asked a question, then maybe you would have an answer to the question at the end. Or if you told a story at the beginning in your exordium, then you would like tie it back to the story at the end. If you can, you don't always have time, depending on how much evidence and harms you list, but it's always a good idea to keep your judge's attention there at the end and tie it all together. And then you'd restate and urge the judge to vote for the resolution there at the end in the conclusion. Okay, does anybody have any questions so far? I'll start getting into the negative arguments.
I have a question about the advantages. Do you tell your students to, I know that you mentioned going back to the harms, but do you tell them that they need to reflect the harms in order? I'm specifically thinking about solvency. I know you haven't talked about that, but.
Right. Yeah. So I would, it's interesting with debate, you do have to show that you can solve your harms. So often what it ends up looking like is especially with beginning debaters, and I saw this even with my son's debate club, a lot of the new debaters, and it's perfectly fine to do this, and maybe it's even good to encourage first-year debaters. Often the harms will be something like many animals are being euthanized for harm 1, and then your advantage 1 would be fewer pets would have to be euthanized for your advantage 1. So they almost like, and I think in the tour guide to debate, I think that's the way that it is laid out, that often the harm will end up mirroring whatever your harm 1 will be mirrored by your advantage 1, basically just showing that it reverses what those harms are. As they get more experienced, a lot of times the plan itself will solve the harms, and you don't necessarily have to point out specifically in your advantages that harm was solved. So you might have, I'm trying to think of examples, but the plan itself may solve for the harm, and then the advantage might be some extra that you can throw in. So we might be able to show that not only were fewer animals euthanized, but animals are living longer lives or something like that. So not only are they not being killed in the shelter, but they're living longer because they're in a home instead of in a shelter. Does that make sense? So it still kind of mirrors, but we're showing a little extra.
Yeah,
and
that's great.
Yeah, that's what you want to aim for. But I would say, unless you have people just wanting to go further, just encourage, even if it's just they're just reversing the harms and their advantages, and that's fine. I think people got pretty caught up in that last year because often one piece of evidence could be used either for a harm or for an advantage if you're just switching the way that you're wording it, because it's often just a reversal of the harm, and that's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I'm not an expert at any of this, so somebody who's actually like, a super experienced policy debater might say, oh, wait a second, that's not quite right. But that's what my opinion, that's what my understanding of it is anyway.
It's always good to hear someone else who has gone through this. This will be my third time going through policy debate, and I still feel shaky on it.
Right. Yeah, I feel like I would feel more shaky if it wasn't for my son's debate club, because I've had to watch so many policy debates and kind of have seen how the judges, they make parents judge. So I've had to judge a lot as well, which makes you have to understand it at a different level when you're judging. But then I've also asked a lot of questions from his policy debate coach, who has been doing this for like 20 something years. And it's really, really good. And she's helped me understand some things. But again, I'm not an expert, so I could be technically wrong. But I think in regards to what we're asking for at CC, I think that that's acceptable to just do that. Okay. Then for the negative case, so whenever I say the negative case, it's a little bit different than the affirmative case because we're not going to be writing a formal speech like the 1AC is. But they do have to come into it beforehand with some ideas of how they might argue against affirmative points. So in general, the negative team uses 4 stock issues to assess the affirmative case. These stock issues, I think, can be a little bit confusing, the terminology. And what I really encourage the students is to not worry too much about using the correct term to attack the case. So in like formal policy debate competitions, you'll often hear them just going through with a negative side, topicality argument 1, significance 1, whatever, and they're labeling it specifically based on the stock issue that they're attacking. But they don't have to do that. And even in the official policy debate, sometimes teams don't even use the words because they know the judges might be confused by the actual terminology. It's all going to depend on with those kind of competitions, who the judges are, if they're going to use the technical terms or not. But really the stock issues are really helpful just to get the negative team thinking about the different ways that they can poke holes in the affirmative case. So the stock issues are, the first one is topicality. So topicality deals with whether or not the affirmative team's case fulfills the resolution. So the resolution in the debate is intended to set reasonable boundaries so that everyone in the debate is talking about the same thing. A case is not topical if it doesn't fall under the resolution. So you can ask the questions, does the case stay within the boundaries of the resolution? And is the case addressing the topics set forward in the resolution? So in topicality, often it's connected to definitions. And you'll see why here. And whenever I went through this boot camp, we practiced these couple things here to kind of talk about the issue of topicality. So if we had the resolution, the United States government should take action to significantly improve the welfare of pets in the United States. And then I had some possible affirmative cases, just a summary. So if there was an affirmative team arguing that that the killing of armadillos will be illegal in all 50 states, why would that not be topical compared to our resolution? Anybody want to chime in what they think?
Maybe the definition of an armadillo wouldn't cover under the definition of pet.
Right. Yeah. So that's what I would say. I picked some examples here that I was hoping were obvious enough to my students that they could easily point out there that, yeah, armadillos aren't usually considered pets. So that wouldn't really fulfill the resolution in the area of topicality because it's not topical. What about a stipend will be given to all monkey owners in America? So I would say that that's similar, the monkey owners, that we don't typically think of very many people in America owning monkeys as a pet. And then also the stipend will be given to all monkey owners in America. So how is that fulfilling, improving the welfare of pets in the United States by giving a stipend to monkey owners? So you could make the argument that that's not topical because it doesn't fit in the resolution, the words of the resolution. And then the last one, U.S. will stop aid to foreign countries that eat dogs. So that one I would say is not topical because it doesn't follow pets in the United States. It wouldn't necessarily be improving the welfare of pets in the U.S. Maybe it would improve welfare of pets in other countries, but not in the United States. So one good thing to think about, to remember when we talk about stock issues, which again, my son's debate coach, I think, was very helpful with this. We had our first debate tournament that we had. I don't think that they heard anybody argue any topicality arguments very much. But then the second debate tournament, we had some new teams come in to debate, and most of those teams would attack people's cases on topicality. And so I asked our debate coach, well, is that case topical? And she kind of looked at me and she was like, well, it depends on how they argued. So these stock issues are not hard and fast. Whenever I said I would say that that's not topical, well, that's my opinion, that doesn't seem like that's topical. The affirmative team can still try to argue that that's topical. So it's a back and forth. There's not like a correct answer, I guess, when you look at stock issues, because it's all about how they argue. If they have evidence that would back up that it is topical, or if their definitions allow for, armadillos as pets, then they could try to make the argument that it is topical. So all these things are not like, and I think whenever we first started last year, I think I saw it as more of a black and white. Is it topical or is it not? And I think it's more of here's an area that you can attack instead of necessarily a black and white issue there. It's all based on how you define your terms and what evidence you have to argue. Okay, that's topicality. You shouldn't have a ton of topicality arguments in first semester if you're constraining your mandates. So if everyone has very similar mandates to fulfill the resolution, then topicality probably won't be an issue that you'll be arguing a ton first semester, because it really comes into play more when you have a whole variety of cases that could fulfill the resolution. Okay, the next stock issue is significance. So significance deals with whether the harms brought up by the affirmative team are really as bad as the affirmative team is arguing, or if they're even occurring at all under the status quo. So harm should be significant in either scope or magnitude, or demonstrate a violation of basic rights. So scope is the number of people affected by the harm. Magnitude is the extent to which people are being harmed. So one example I gave during our debate boot camp is about the shooting of Abraham Lincoln. So you could maybe argue that the scope is small in the shooting of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Only one person was murdered there. So it's not real great in scope maybe, but in magnitude, it's huge, because the extent that people were harmed all across the United States was huge. It really made a huge impact in the future of the United States with his assassination, even though it was just the death of one man. So you would ask the questions, are the harms significant enough to warrant change? Are the harms actually happening to the extent the affirmative team argues? And are the harms occurring at all? Are they even occurring at all? So then we practiced here with the affirmative harm. If the affirmative harm was pets are abandoned to shelters each year, and then the evidence was given, 117 pets were abandoned to shelters in the United States in 2019. So obviously, that evidence is only talking about a very small amount of pets compared to all the pets in the United States. So a negative team could come in and argue that that's not a significant enough number for us to go and pass a law to change anything, when they're saying that only 117 pets were abandoned to shelters last year. And then we looked at the example, some puppy breeders are cruel toward their animals. And then the evidence was a puppy mill in Alabama feeds their puppies only off-brand food. The puppies were also only allowed 1 hour of outside play each day. So the negative team could look at that evidence and say, why would we pass a law just because there are some puppies that have to eat off-brand food, or that the puppies in these puppy mills are only allowed 1 hour of outside play each day? That doesn't seem like a very significant thing to be passing new laws over, that it's not that big of a deal. Okay. I think significance is one of the easiest of the stock issues, because just the title of it makes sense, significance, if it's significant or not. Inherency is the next stock issue. I think inherency it's the one that's most confusing to me. Inherency assesses the cause and effect of issues to be sure that the problems are matched up to the correct solutions. So inherency would assess whether or not the affirmative's harms are actually caused by the current policy, and thus can be changed by fixing it. So are those harms something that are happening for other reasons, that even if we changed the current policy, that they're going to continue to happen anyway, because they're not caused by the current policy? So we can ask questions, are there alternate causes to the harms? Are the harms already being solved in another way? And does the affirmative team's plan already exist in the status quo? That last question really comes into play with the big national debate tournaments that happen. They get a resolution, the different clubs get a resolution that will be the same resolution throughout the whole year. And so they might pick some mandates to fulfill the resolution at the beginning of the year, that sometimes by the end of the year, Congress may have passed a plan that already is exactly like what their plan is. So it's already been passed. And that's a big thing with the policy debate clubs. You can't have a plan that's already in action, because now that's just become the status quo. So they have to continually be researching and keeping up with things and making sure that their plan hasn't passed, because somebody could bring up an argument during the debate tournament saying, whoa, 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 you're arguing for something that's already the status quo. Okay, so then we practiced here. So if the affirmative harm said, if there was an affirmative team that had a harm that said many animals are euthanized in shelters every year, and then we had an affirmative plan that was requiring each household to adopt one animal from a shelter, I would say the reason why the affirmative team put that harm in, that many animals are euthanized in shelters every year, is because they would argue that the reason that animals are euthanized is because shelters are overcrowded, and that's causing many animals to be euthanized every year. So if we required each household to adopt one animal, then we wouldn't have overcrowding in shelters, and that would cause animals not to be euthanized. But a negative team could come in and say, well, many animals are being euthanized for other reasons besides the fact that shelters are crowded. What about animals that are euthanized because they've attacked kids and hurt them? So we have to put them down because they might hurt another kid. What about animals that are euthanized because they're diseased? And just requiring each household to adopt one animal from a shelter isn't going to fix that harm that many animals are euthanized every year. Does that make sense? This one is a little bit trickier, I think, to see. Let me go over the next one too, and then if people have questions, you can ask questions. If we had the affirmative harm, many people are unhealthy, and then the plan require each household to adopt one animal from a shelter. Again, the affirmative team would be saying many people are unhealthy because they don't get enough exercise, because they're lonely, all those things. And then if they have pets, then they're going to get more exercise, and they're not going to be lonely anymore. They'll have companionship. So if we required each household to adopt an animal, it's going to solve some of those causes for them being unhealthy. But the negative team could come in and say, wait a second, many people are unhealthy for lots of other reasons. They're unhealthy because they have heart disease, or because they're obese, or because all these things. And just requiring each household to adopt one animal from a shelter isn't going to solve the problem of why people are unhealthy. So they would attack it based on inherency by saying basically that those harms are not caused completely by the fact that people don't have to adopt pets from animal shelters. Let's see, I've got the chat window just popped up, so I'm going to look back through some of these questions that people have asked. Let's see. Sorry, have just missed all these chatting because my chat box wouldn't come up. I think these are mostly ones I've answered. Let's see. So are you saying that you would just hypothetically come up with these affirmative cases to be able to brainstorm about topicality? I found this part especially confusing last year when thinking through both sides of the issue without parts being assigned yet in Challenge 1 class. Yes, so I would just go through and we just brainstorm everything that we can, and then brainstorm different cases and talk about topicality. I think they really are hesitant, and I have to really encourage them to stop worrying about it, that they'll have some kind of good argument that they think is great that they don't want to bring up in class because they're afraid that then the other team will see what their arguments are. But I think they're, like in my son's debate club, they go through and practice a ton outside of debate tournaments. And, it only makes your arguments better if you're going to be running them past people and really brainstorming all the different ways that it could be attacked. It's just a good idea to go ahead and just brainstorm all of those things in as much as you can in class. But let's see, so you're saying that if a team makes an argument that the other team thinks is not topical, they would sort of object to it in the course of their argument? Yeah, so whenever they go to give their speech, the negative team during one of their speeches would say, here are my arguments against the affirmative team. One good way to do that is to say, well, the affirmative team says that their plan, would do this, 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 but we say that plan does not fall under the resolution. It's not topical, and here's the reasons why we would argue that it's not topical. Topicality is specifically tied to the mandates. Topicality would have to do with whether or not their plan fulfills the resolution. So I think that would deal with if their mandates fulfill the resolution. It's kind of the entire case though, because they would pick their harms and their advantages and all that to kind of support their case. So but yes, it would be, I guess, specifically tied to the way that they're planning on fulfilling the resolution. Often people would say that it's tied to the definitions instead of saying that it's tied to the mandates. And that's just because it's all about how you define those terms, how you define the terms in the mandate of whether or not it's going to fulfill the resolution. So often the topicality arguments are often focused a lot on definitions because it's all about how you define those words in the resolution. And then if a team hears the other team make the US take, I'm trying to read what this, I can't. Oh, make the mistake of using one of these stock issues, how do they address it? If the team hears the other team make the mistake of using one of these stock issues, I don't understand that question. Becky Forrester, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I guess I'm just, I think I'm confused maybe about what these stock issues are. Are they sort of like, could I compare them to things that could be objected to in a mock trial? Like if another team says something and like like these stock issues they're mistakes, right? They're things that you're not supposed to, like you're not supposed to say things that are off topic, or you're not supposed to say things that, I don't know, that break this inherency rule or something like that, right? And
yeah, but maybe not as, in mock trial, it's a little bit more like of a hard and fast, like you can't ask leading questions on direct examination. It's a little bit more of a hard and fast rule. These are a little bit more of ways to argue. So you could argue that they're not topical, but you have to make the argument well, because you're not going to just get granted by the judge if you just say topicality 1, that's not topical. They argued this and it's not topical. You'd have to show why it's not topical. And then the affirmative team could get back up and show why they think it is topical by saying, well, this was my definition and it fulfills that definition. So
you'd need to be like a team would need to be kind of thinking ahead and going, okay, we need to make sure that the arguments that we have are airtight and that the other team couldn't say about any of these that they're off topic, that they're not topical, right? Like,
right.
Okay.
Yeah, they'd want to be doing, as they're constructing their case, they want to be doing a good job of thinking about all these stock issues and making sure that they're not just falling into using something that's not topical or using, harms that aren't significant or any of those things. But again, it's all about how you argue it for sure. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's just all it's new to me. So these are probably really obvious questions.
No, not at all.
To everybody.
I think stock issues were an area that was very confusing. I think just thinking of these stock issues really is just brainstorming for how can I attack their case, and then brainstorming for the affirmative team, how can I make sure that my case, is a good case by making sure that it, does all these things that holes can't be poked in my arguments based on these issues.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last one is solvency. So solvency, again, I think significance and solvency are the two easiest ones because solvency is just like what it sounds like. Does the affirmative team's plan actually solve the problems that they identified? So you can ask the questions, does the affirmative team's plan actually solve the harms they claim? Will the affirmative team's plan actually bring about the advantages that they claim? So then I had them practice here. We went through some harms and then we went through some advantages, all based on the plan that require each household to adopt one animal from a shelter. So if we had the harm, puppy breeders are cruel toward their animals. If our plan required each household to adopt one animal from a shelter, would that necessarily solve the harm that puppy breeders are cruel toward their animals? Not necessarily. You could make the argument that puppy breeders are still going to be in demand even if you made everybody adopt one pet from a shelter, because people want, well, my family has a mini Labradoodle and we like him. So maybe we would have still gotten a mini Labradoodle even if we had to adopt one from a shelter. So people may still want a specific breed of animal, may still want to have a puppy instead of an adult dog. So you wouldn't necessarily put puppy breeders out of business. So they may still be cruel toward their animals if they have too many animals or whatever else. Kids without pets don't learn responsibility. Well, just because we require each household to adopt a pet doesn't necessarily mean that kids are going to be responsible now, or that they're going to learn to be responsible. The affirmative team would have to have some evidence showing that the negative team can say, wait a second, you're not going to necessarily be responsible just because you have a pet. I've already talked about that many Americans are unhealthy. Again, we could say just having this plan doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to solve the fact that Americans are unhealthy. Local pet shelters need help. I had someone point out, well, just because we passed this plan, maybe it would end up making local pet shelters need even more help, because now they have to manage this having a household adopt one pet from their shelter, are they going to be involved in the process of making sure that each household adopts a pet? Do they have to keep some kind of registry of who adopted from their shelter? They may still need help after the plan's passed. And the advantages, puppy breeders will go out of business. Same from what we set up there for harm. You wouldn't necessarily be able to show that they're going to go out of business just from passing that plan. And then the responsible and the healthy, we kind of already talked about those in regards to the harms. So you can ask some questions. How could the affirmative case be attacked using the issue of solvency? What evidence would show that the affirmative team's plan won't solve their harms? How could the negative team argue that the affirmative team's plan will not actually bring about the advantages that they claim it will? This is definitely an area where the negative team could do research beforehand and kind of anticipate, if they're going to start trying to show that it's going to help the problem of puppy breeders or puppy mills or whatever, then they could have some statistics that talk about how many puppies are adopted from or bought from puppy breeders every year, and maybe be able to show that you're not going to be able to solve that by requiring each household to adopt one animal. Okay, so those were the 4 stock issues. There's other ways that you can attack the affirmative case, not just on stock issues. And I do encourage my students, like, just because your argument that you have against an affirmative team's argument, even if you can't categorize it in one of those 4 stock issues, that's okay. We're going to argue based on logic and based on other areas that it doesn't necessarily have to fit into one of those 4 stock issues. These are 2 other ways. Among others, I didn't necessarily list every way that you can attack, but you would want to be listening closely when the affirmative team reads their sources for their evidence. The tour guide debate book from CC points out this credible, published, and recent CPR, remembering that it needs to be credible, needs to be published, and needs to be recent. So they can't just like write down their opinion, like quote their next door neighbor. It's not published at that point. So that means that it wouldn't be something that both sides have access to. So it needs to be something that's actually published so that both sides would have access to it. Recent is another area that can be argued of whether you think it's recent or not. A general guideline, you would want to have something over the past like 5 years or so, if possible. But there's some evidence that's going to be kind of universal, even if it is older than that. And it just depends on the evidence. If it's evidence that's just more like defining the general issues in the case, sometimes that can be an older source. You want to make sure that the evidence is actually supporting the argument that they're making. Sometimes people will give a tagline and then have evidence that really doesn't seem to back up what their tagline was. You want to be evaluating if the author is an expert in their area in the field, or if the author is quoting people who are experts, statistics from reputable sources. Does the author or publisher have a clear bias? So like when I was talking about using ilovepets.com, that's going to have a clear bias. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that you can't use an author or a source, a publisher that has a bias. A lot of the articles that I have in my Bodycam packet do have some sources that are a little bit more biased toward one way or the other. Or I think everyone does have some kind of bias, right? We can't say that we're going to have a completely unbiased thing. Everybody has kind of a bent of where they're coming from. But you just want to be careful with what evidence you pick, because the negative team could come back and point out, wait a second, all of your evidence came from police organizations. So, how are we going to trust that your evidence is real evidence because it's all ones that support police officers? So you want to make sure that you're using, at least a variety of evidence. If you do quote, one that's from a police source, you might want to quote some others from different other sources. And then another thing that the negative team has that they can bring up are disadvantages. So disadvantages are the bad things that will happen if the affirmative team's plan is passed. So don't confuse those with harms. Harms are the bad things that are going on with the status quo. Disadvantages are things that happen if the plan is passed. So they can kind of, go through and think about all the different things that would happen. So you could look at your negative often. What about the people that are allergic? If you required each household to adopt a pet, well, you're going to have some people that are allergic. that are going to have to now have a pet in their home. We're going to lose freedoms. It costs a lot of money. Pets are expensive. So there'd be a lot of disadvantages even just from that Annie chart that you could bring up. So negative. So often, you know, some cases like this pet one, there's some of this that's so ludicrous of saying that you would really require every household to adopt a pet. You'd probably be able to come up with most of your negative speech just on disadvantages of all the bad things that would happen if the plan was passed. Okay, then general debate tips. The tour guide pointed out these 3 areas, and I kind of expanded on it some. You know, effective persuasion, you want to be using a combination of logos, ethos, and pathos. You want to have logic and facts. You want to have credibility, you know, experts that are supporting your side, and you want to have pathos. You want to have some emotion involved. If you don't have emotion involved at all, then it turns into a very like boring debate. So you want to be trying to bring in some emotional kind of arguments to back up your case. So I'm not going to read through all those because I think you guys can read through that. But I did encourage them, and I will throughout the semester, you know, how are you bringing up logic here? How are you, what sources do you have? Do they have good credibility? And are you trying to engage your judges? Are you adding in those impacts, the impacting of your evidence that are, you know, tying it into engaging people's emotions? Do they feel your argument? Okay, so that's the end of the portion that I talked about the pet issue. I'm running way later than what we did on the first time I went through this, but that's okay. I can go a little bit late because I do want to cover this last part. But does anybody have any questions about everything so far? Anything so far? Okay.
Yes, I had one question that I was just curious about from a long time ago. And I'm sorry, I'm backtracking here, but the original resolution at the very beginning, who comes up with that? Is that the affirmative team, or is that us, the directors, that come up with the resolution?
Yeah, resolution would be something that you would decide on as a class or as the director. I'm gonna just come up with the resolution for at least for first semester debate, because they, you know, they don't know anything about debate yet. So I'll come up with the resolution first semester, and so the whole class will know that. Second semester, I'll probably give them, depending on how things go, I'll probably give them a little bit of freedom of giving me some ideas to decide what we're going to do for second semester. But again, that will be a group effort, not just the affirmative team.
Okay.
For us to decide on. And debate club kind of things, if they're doing it like for a debate club, whatever organization that they debate for. So there are different like national debate organizations. They will come up with a resolution and put that out before the debate year starts, so that everyone. So it's usually something that the debaters don't have anything to do with. It's just something that's put forward by the organization that they're debating with.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so for my class, everything from now on is all specific to the issue that I'm going to be doing for my class, working through the what I mentioned before, the body cam issue. So I went ahead and told them the resolution is going to be the United States federal government should substantially reform policing in the United States. I believe that I put on the Facebook page, I believe that I put a Word document there, not a PDF. If I'm wrong about that, y'all are welcome to message me later and let me know, because I can upload the Word document instead, but I think I did. So you guys should be able to change this if you decide to pick a different resolution and you wanted to use this workbook. So for the sake of simplicity for our first debate, all mandates must be related to police body cameras. One mandate must state that all police officers in the United States will be required to wear body cameras. And then other mandates may set requirements on when the officer must record, how footage is stored or released, etc. And as they do their research, they'll see a whole bunch of different ideas of things that they could do for mandates. So they could just do just the one mandate that all police officers have to wear body cameras, or they can add other mandates. So policy debate involves a lot of research. Even in the clubs, like they spend way more time researching than they do actually debating. And really, I think the skill that we want to focus on in policy debate is everything leading up to the debate is they've almost done all of their work by the time they get to actually debating, because it involves a lot of research and a lot of thought beforehand, thinking through both sides of the argument and really understanding both sides of the argument. If they go into the actual debate with a really good understanding of both sides, then you'll have a lot more success actually debating. And then the actual debating also is a skill that's a focus that we can practice in little snippets throughout the semester. I do a lot of even just pulling out of a hat some silly issues, like I had us debate like whether men should open doors for women, and that was just one of the things that they pulled from a cup of ideas. And then I just give them like a minute to prepare, and then you have to go up and argue for 2 minutes about why men should have to open doors, and then somebody else would come in with basically no preparation and have to argue for a minute or two on the negative side of why men shouldn't have to open doors. So we do some of that practicing in class, but really speaking in front of people in this kind of way, especially when you're everything besides that first speech, the 1AC, all the rest of the speeches, you really have to think on your feet. So you have to listen to what the other side says, and you have to be prepared already beforehand with some arguments that you've thought out and evidence that you have prepared to bring up. And then you have to think on your feet a ton, because it's kind of continually changing based on what the other side says. And some kids are going to be naturally better at that than others. But everyone can get better just by practicing. And I tell them before the first debate that we have that I expect it to be a train wreck, and it's okay because they've never done this before. So when we actually start our first real debate, it's probably going to be pretty messy, and that's okay, because we're going to all have good attitudes and help each other. And really it's about learning the process and getting practice, and then hopefully by second semester the debates will look a little bit better after they've kind of seen how it goes. But I definitely in my son's debate club judged some rounds that were more disastrous than others, to the point where I had one first year debater debating like a fourth year debater who finally just said, I think after had come back with a bunch of good arguments, she just came up and said, he made a lot of really good arguments, I don't know what to say. So that's going to happen, and it's okay. But they've still done the skill of debating, just in all their preparation and thinking through beforehand. Okay, so then with our issue here, before beginning to research the issue, we kind of talked through some of these terminologies during the debate boot camp. And since we're running so late on time, I'm not going to go through the specifics of this, but we kind of talked in our boot camp about getting definitions for some of these things like body cameras. I think I ended up on the Department of Justice, found some helpful definitions for that, but that's going to take some time. So we didn't exactly spend a lot of time during our boot camp going into specifics about that. But as they begin to start researching their issue, they're going to want to make sure that they understand what all those terms actually are. And then another important aspect, research before they begin to construct their case, is the status quo. So they need to do some research about, what are the laws right now. And I kind of gave them just an introduction to this because the policy of the body cam issue isn't going to necessarily be familiar to them. So I kind of pointed out that there's no federal regulations regarding policing right now. We don't really have any laws that are on the books that would affect at a federal level all local police departments. That's usually done more at a local level. There are a couple of states, I think from the time that I did the research, there are a couple of states that require body cams, but only a few, I think like 2 that fully require it, and then maybe 3 others that require some some parts of the police department to use body cameras. And then there's obviously a lot of local areas that would require body camera. So as they start doing their research, they're going to see a lot of harms in their reading, where people would point out that maybe part of the problem with policing is the fact that there aren't any federal regulations. So that could even be a harm that they end up using later, just the fact that there aren't any federal regulations. So we talked about this a little bit, but I told them, you know, your research is not this, you're gonna have to do more research about this so that you understand what the status quo is regarding policing. And then brainstorming the issue. So this could apply to any issue that you pick, but this is all things that I wrote down that I think was the most helpful for me of how I would attack a big issue like this. This is not necessarily the right way to do it. So I want to make sure everybody understands that. This is not like some debate official, you know, way to start researching. This is some tips that I thought were helpful. So I would begin reading the articles about the issue. If you don't understand a term or any background information given, make note of it and research it later. Read through the articles for the first time with the goal of understanding the basic points and plan to dig deeper later. So I did encourage my students, if there are things that they don't understand that meant that they couldn't understand the article at all, then they might need to stop and go ahead and look some of those things up. But in general, I think you should be able to read the articles that students should be able to at kind of a basic level without having to do more looking. And then they do need to later look more into things that they didn't understand. You can do a lot of rabbit trails, I think, with a lot of these articles, because it's a complicated issue when you actually get into the nitty gritty. There are a lot of things that you could go research rabbit trails. So as you read, highlight affirmative points in one color and negative points in another color. So I encourage them with this to start out with brainstorming, to look at these body camera articles as basically anything that at all that sounded positive toward body cameras to highlight as affirmative, and anything at all that sounded negative towards body cameras to highlight in another color. And then you're going to transfer a summary of each point onto an Annie chart. So what we did in class, we had one, you can see the next page is an Annie chart that we just had one master. But what I did whenever I read my articles is I had a separate Annie chart for each article that I read. So it's up to them if they want to have one master Annie chart or if they want to just do a separate one for each article. There's benefits for both. If you have a separate for each article, it's a little easier to see what points you got from each article that you read. But then if you have a master, it's easier to kind of see what kind of is coming up more often. You're able to see, you don't have to write as much either, because often the same arguments will come up. So you wouldn't necessarily have to list it again on the Annie chart if you get the same point from a different article. So they just need to have some way that they're organizing that. And then again, use the I column for points that need further investigation in order to determine if they're affirmative or negative. Sometimes there's points that, like, I don't really know if this supports the affirmative side or the negative side. And then there's questions that need to be looked into regarding the implementation of policies that they might need to write down in the I column. And then also, as you read the articles, be on the lookout for harms that are listed in the articles, and I have them highlight the harms in a different color than the affirmative and negative points. For this issue, if you think about it, for body cameras, some of my articles will be a more specific article about body cameras. And for this issue, you might end up having some harms that are more general, that aren't necessarily specific to body cameras, but are more about policing in general. So you might have a harm that says something like, we've had, a lot of problems with police being accountable to the public in general, or that, there have been many interactions in the last year or two that have shown that we need some change in policing in the United States for one reason or the other. So sometimes those are not necessarily specific to body cameras, but they would be specific to the resolution about policing and that we want to solve those problems about policing by doing some things with body cameras. So the articles that we went through, so this next page is just another Annie chart, so same as the other. So whether body cameras are a good way to reform policing in the United States. So I worded it that way so that we can have a general brainstorming about body cameras in the United States. So I used this article, Body Worn Cameras, What the Evidence Tells Us. And this is one of the ones in that packet that I emailed out. If anyone needs that, just send me a message later and I can email that to you. So I handed out these articles and I had the students go through, spend some time reading them and go through and do some highlighting for their affirmative and negative points. And then I just asked them to, after we finished, everybody kind of got a chance to do most of it. Then we went through and added those to a master Annie chart. So before we did the boot camp, I went through and highlighted some things myself so I would be prepared to bring stuff up. So one thing I highlighted as a harm was this paragraph that talks about, can't get it highlighted all the way, but you get the point, that paragraph, that part of the paragraph, that a number of recent civil disturbances across the United States subsequent to instances of lethal use of force by officers highlight the ongoing challenges in maintaining the public's perceptions of law enforcement legitimacy, particularly as it concerns the use of force. So you wouldn't use that as your harm tagline. That's long. That might be the evidence that you use in your harm tagline, but maybe I'd say as my harm tagline, maybe would say that there has been something like there are challenges in or maybe I'd just say that the public's perception of law enforcement legitimacy has been challenged, or civil disturbances show lots of uses of lethal force, or something like that. But in general, this is speaking to the bad things that are happening in the status quo. So I highlighted that as a harm. I came down through here, highlighted this as an affirmative, that the body cameras could be used as a surveillance tool to promote officer safety and efficiency and prevent crime. Someone pointed out that them being used as a surveillance tool could also have been a negative point, that we could say that we don't want to have body cameras because they could be used as a surveillance tool. So you could add that both to the affirmative and the negative. The good thing about this article is that when it goes through here, the potential benefits often, or all these paragraphs are kind of categorized for us. So you could say better transparency is a benefit of police body cameras. And then if you read this paragraph, you could even highlight different things in the paragraph. So you could say better transparency. Here's a harm. In many communities, there's a lack of trust and confidence in law enforcement. That it might provide better documentation would be an affirmative point, that body cameras would provide better documentation, that it could confirm the nature of events, support accounts articulated by officers. Anyway, you can list all those things separate as well. But this article does a good job of going through and kind of categorizing things. So even the ones that are slower readers could go through and just highlight those main points. Okay, so that's a general overview of that article. And then the other article that we talked about, so this one was more, the first article was more affirmative leaning. There are a few negative points you can find in that article if you're reading it carefully. And then this article was a little bit more negative leaning, well, a lot more negative leaning. So it's going to bring up a lot of negative points, and then you can find some harms from that article as well with what's bad in the status quo. So I don't think I'm going to go through that article fully just because of time, but you get the idea. Does anybody have questions about that? So I just had them walk through those articles. highlighting things and then telling me what to add to the Annie chart. So we kind of brainstormed an Annie chart where we listed those issues, listed the affirmative and negative points for body cameras. Okay. Then same thing with the harms as when we talked about the pet issue. We listed any harms that people came up with from those 2 articles. I'm going to continue throughout the class. I'll bring in a couple of articles during our class times when the semester actually starts, and we'll kind of just keep a running list of possible harms that people have brainstormed, so they can continue adding to their list here that we started during our boot camp. Again, there's those questions down there that kind of think through when we're thinking about which harms we would pick finally. And then I wanted us to practice as part of our debate boot camp by going through the article and finding a harm. So like I was saying earlier of how maybe you would word something when you find an evidence quote in your harm. So we just went through and found a couple and then practice making a tagline, quoting what part of the evidence we want to quote to back up that tagline. And then you list your source and then how would we impact that. So we would want to be doing a lot of this article. One thing that I highlighted here is a harm. There's no nationwide standard governing when body cameras should be turned off and on. So you could use that as a harm, and then you would want to impact that by saying, you know, since there's no nationwide standard, people are all, you know, states are all over the place about what they require for body camera usage. Okay, there's a couple people with their hands raised. What questions do you have?
I was just going to ask, do the students actually say the tagline out loud?
Yes.
Okay, so it needs to be like a well-formed sentence.
Yes, or it could just be a phrase. You don't necessarily have to have it be a full sentence. They could say, harm 1, many euthanized animals. Like often in policy debates where at like the club level, they have so much information packed into that 1AC that they're often just having something very abbreviated, like many animals euthanized, or for this, like the officer accountability, that maybe you'd have a tagline that just said that. You want it to be something very short that a judge could remember, or even that a judge could jot down, that it would be something very short, and then you would give your evidence, and then you would kind of expound on that in your impacting. So as tight, I think, as you can summarize that, the better, so that your points are very easy to follow. If you had some kind of big, long sentence, it might be harder to tell exactly what, you know, that boils down to. You want it to be something that's just kind of boiling it down to a couple of words as much as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Anybody else? I think there was another hand raised. Okay. Oh, Becky Forrester said raised hand.
No, that was me that already
Okay.
asked the question.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll move on unless anybody else has a question. Okay, so then we went through mandates. This is the area where I was mentioning earlier. I think since I'm going to allow a couple of more mandates if they want. So the mandate 1 will have to be that all police officers in the United States will be required to wear body cameras when on duty. But then each team can list up to 2 more mandates if they want. And so I think as we read these articles, it's very easy to see that if all we did was require for police officers to wear body cameras, there would be a lot of loopholes there of, well, then they don't have to keep them turned on all the time. They could turn them off when they think something bad's about to happen. What about some questions that can come up in some of the articles are things like, what about when they're interviewing a victim of sexual assault, that person may be way less likely to give full information if they know they're being videoed. So will the officer be allowed to turn it off when they're videoing someone that's with a sensitive, subject like that? Will they have to tell the people that they're videoing? Will they have to tell them that they're being videoed? Do they have to announce that their body camera is turned on? Privacy issues come up in regards to that. Are they going to be allowed to have their body cameras on even when they're not engaged in some sort of conflict? So will it turn into another tool that police can use to interview people or to video people to collect evidence, for a crime? There are some states that have laws that require you to tell people before you video them. So anyway, there's a lot that comes up in the articles that you could brainstorm different mandates that could be added. And it's interesting because when you add a new mandate, often it could end up changing your Annie chart to where some negative points now are affirmative points, but it could end up adding another negative point, even if it takes one away. So we talked through these examples here. If the negative point is that police have too much control over when to turn body cameras on or off, when we did our Annie chart, then you could maybe have a mandate that would say require police officers to keep body cameras turned on while on active duty. So that would take away that negative point, but like I mentioned before, it would also add a negative point, or if it's not already there, that it would cost more money to store that much data if they're having their camera on all the time. So I like this issue because I like that there's not, at least from what I see, I don't think that there's like a lot of just really black and white that this affirmative point's just going to win the debate, because there's two sides to that. So I think it's a great thing for debate, and that's part of why I love debate so much. I really want to encourage in our kids to do a better job than we've done as adults. If you look on Facebook and see the way that things are argued on Facebook, it's really discouraging. I want our students to really try to thoroughly understand both sides of this issue and not be as dogmatic in saying this is definitely right and not being able to see the other side's point. Now, it's good for them to have opinions, and I think I'm sure that they're going to end up agreeing with one side, maybe more than the other, but they're going to have to argue both sides, and I want to encourage them to argue both sides passionately, even if they disagree with it. And I think that's a beautiful thing with policy debate. I know when I did, they were doing current events a little bit differently in B a few years ago when I did it, and I think my students really struggled with if they really felt strongly about an issue and that I made them argue for the other side. It's almost like they could not do that, because if they brought up any good points for the other side, it was like they're giving their argument away. And I just think it's very helpful for us to be able to see, the other side's best arguments. Let's be willing to go ahead and bring up those best arguments of the other side, and be able to think of ways that we can, argue against some of those best arguments instead of just trying to let's just squash the other side's arguments because I don't want to admit anything, instead of saying, oh, they do have a good point there. So this really encourages them to have to really see both sides, since they're going to have to argue both the affirmative and the negative. And like I said, sometimes there are things that will end up eliminating one argument against them, but then opens up a whole other can of worms with another argument against it. So there's a lot of back and forth, I think, with this issue. So questions to ask about that. Are there particularly harmful negative points that could be eliminated with an additional mandate? If you think that they have a really, really good point that's going to be hard to counter, well, is there a way that you can add a mandate that would kind of do away with that negative point? Do you have evidence that certain policies will help more than others? Can you solve your harms with the mandates you propose? Are there additional advantages you could list if you added an additional mandate? But remember that I am constraining them to only 3 mandates total, and one of them is decided for them. So they're only allowed 2 other mandates. And I did that on purpose just to try to keep things a little bit simpler for the negative team, so you don't have such a wide variety of mandates that you might have to argue against. And then same thing as with the pet issue, we went through some advantages that we looked at from the articles that I brought in. So you can refer back to your Annie chart. I think that keeping an ongoing Annie chart with just simple affirmative and negative points, not necessarily labeled as harms or advantages, is really helpful because it's just very good to be able to just look at a simple form, even in the middle of a debate, I think, and be able to say, oh, here are some negative points that I could bring up, or here are some more affirmative things I need to, encourage in some of those later affirmative speeches. But so we can look back at our Annie chart that we did for body cameras that we started. Again, that's going to be added to throughout the semester as we read more articles and think through it more. But often in that Annie chart, there'll be advantages already listed there, or that may just need to be reworded a little bit to turn them into it being worded as an advantage. Someone asked last time about evidence for advantages. Sometimes it can get tricky because we're saying that if our plan is passed, then these good things are going to come about. And so you don't always have great statistics because the plan hasn't been passed yet. So we can't necessarily say 100% that this is what's going to happen. So often their advantages evidence will end up being something that gets reworded a little bit. You don't reword the actual evidence, but you would end up tagging it in a certain way, and then you would pick the part of the evidence that supports your advantage, and then you give the source and all that. I also gave the example last time. Sometimes for advantages, we look back at this where I have the evidence quote and all that. Sometimes you might have to give multiple pieces of evidence in order to back up your advantage. So for example, for the for the pet issue, I think we had the advantage that fewer pets would be euthanized in the United States, or something like that, that maybe you would have so if it was fewer pets would be euthanized in the United States, maybe for your evidence, you would have one piece of evidence that said how many pets are euthanized every year in the United States. And then you would have another piece of evidence that says how many households exist in the United States. And then for my impact, I would tie those two things together by saying, 10,000 animals are euthanized in America. I'm just making up numbers, but 10,000 animals are euthanized in America every year. There are 20,000 households. Obviously, that's not correct numbers, but 20,000 households in the United States. So we have twice as many households as the number of animals that are euthanized. And so it would definitely solve for the number of animals euthanized, and even more, because we have plenty of households to account for that. Does that make sense? Sometimes you have to put two pieces of evidence, I think, to make your case, and that's okay. You just would want to be careful about how long those evidence, how long that is. And they would want to practice their 1AC a whole bunch of times before they actually do it to make sure you can fit it in the amount of time that you have. But so for advantages, sometimes you have to be a little bit creative with the evidence that you would use to back up your advantage, because it's a little bit hard sometimes to show that it's actually, to find evidence that would back it up. Not always, though. Okay, so that we practiced some advantage taglines and the evidence, all that. And then the last thing that I have in this policy debate workbook is a more thorough 1AC template. I think it's helpful. Somebody had posted on the Facebook group, I think last year, a 1AC template that did this, and I took some ideas from that whenever I made this, because I think having some transitions in and seeing the students kind of seeing how I would word these things is helpful. So I have this template that they can use later when they write their 1AC. My intention for the boot camp was for us to write a very simple 1AC as part of the boot camp, but we didn't have near enough time to do that. So we didn't end up doing that.